The memory of that morning is not a photograph in my mind. It is a relic, preserved in a specific, painful amber. It was April 3rd, 1989. The sky over our Ohio farm was the color of a day-old bruise, a flat, watery gray that promised a cold rain. The air smelled of wet earth and the distant, metallic tang from the mill. My son, Michael, was 24 years old. He moved through our kitchen with the quiet efficiency of a man certain of his place in the world. His work boots making a solid, familiar sound on the linoleum I'd installed myself. He poured his coffee black, the way I'd taught him. The steam rose in a thin plume, framing his face, a younger, brighter version of my own, but with his mother's clear, direct eyes. Clara stood at the stove, her back to us, tending to the bacon. The sizzle was a domestic symphony, the radio a soft counterpoint of a George Jones ballad. It was a diorama of a life we had built, piece by careful piece. "Drive safe, Mike," I said, the words a ritual. My voice was still rough with sleep. He turned, his denim jacket smelling of oil and fresh air. He smiled, a flash of white in his tanned face. "Always do, Dad. I'll be back by 6. Don't let Mom save me the burnt bacon." He kissed Clara's cheek. She swatted him playfully with a dish towel, but her smile was a brief, sunlit thing. 6, she said, her voice firm. "I'm making meatloaf." And then he was gone. The door closed with a soft, final click. The sound of his truck engine, a 1982 Ford F-150 with a misfire in the second cylinder I'd been meaning to fix, rumbled to life. It faded slowly, the crunch of gravel on the long road out becoming fainter and fainter, swallowed by the heavy morning silence. I stood at the window, watching the empty space between the bare-limbed maples where his truck had vanished. Clara came to stand beside me, wiping her hands on her apron. "He's growing up so fast," she murmured, her shoulder brushing mine. "He's still our boy," I replied, the words feeling hollow even as I said them. He was a man. But in that moment, a cold finger, subtle as a draft, traced a path down my spine. The air in the room felt different, thicker. It was the silence after the symphony, and it had a weight to it that I couldn't name. I spent the day in the barn, trying to lose myself in the tactile world of grease and steel. I was rebuilding the carburetor on the old John Deere, a task that usually brought me a monk-like focus, but my hands felt clumsy. The smell of gasoline, usually a tonic, was cloying. Around noon, the promised rain began, a slow, insistent drizzle that tapped a morbid rhythm on the corrugated tin roof. Each drop was a second passing, each second an inch of distance growing between me and my son. By 5 o'clock, the knot in my stomach had tightened into a hard, cold fist. The rain had stopped, leaving the world glistening and somber. I stood on the porch, the damp wood seeping cold through my socks. The driveway was a dark, empty ribbon. 6 o'clock came, no headlights. 7, the sky turned to velvet, then to ink. By 8, Clara had stopped pretending to tidy the kitchen. She was packing, a caged bird in a gilded cage we had built together. The silence was no longer empty. It was a presence, a third person in the room, sucking the warmth from the walls. "Call the mill," I said, my voice too loud in the hush. She moved to the phone, her fingers trembling as she dialed the number she knew by heart. I watched her face, saw the hope in her eyes die as the voice on the other end spoke. She hung up slowly, the plastic receiver clicking into the cradle like a tombstone settling. "He clocked out at 4, she whispered. "They said he left alone. No one saw anything." I tried to summon the platitudes of a rational man. The truckee, maybe it broke down, maybe he stopped to help someone. But the words were ash in my mouth. The road between here and the mill was straight and well-traveled. If his truck had failed, he would have walked to a farmhouse, used a phone, he would have called. At 2:00 a.m., driven by a restlessness that felt like madness, I grabbed my coat. "I'm driving the route," I told Clara. Her face was a pale, terrified moon in the lamplight. She just nodded, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. I took the same truck he had, the one with the misfire. The headlights cut twin tunnels through the oppressive darkness, illuminating nothing but the slick black asphalt and the skeletal forms of sleeping trees. I drove slowly, my window down, the cold air biting my face. I wasn't just looking, I was listening. For the sound of his voice, for the sputter of his engine, for anything. I stopped at every darkened farmhouse, my knuckles rapping on silent doors, my apologies to sleepy, confused strangers sounding more desperate each time. I peered into ditches, my heart in my throat, terrified of what the light might reveal. I found nothing, not a trace, not a scrap of fabric, not a dropped tool, not a single tire mark out of place. It was as if the earth had opened up and swallowed him whole, truck and all. When I returned home, the sky was lightening to a grim, featureless grey. Clara was still in her chair by the window, the lamp still on. She hadn't moved. She looked at me, and in her eyes I saw the reflection of my own devastating truth. I had nothing to give her. No hope, no answers, just the cold, empty silence of the dawn. That morning became the fissure that split the world. There was before a land of color and sound and simple certainties, and there was after a monochrome country of waiting. His work boots, caked with yesterday's mud, remained by the door. His jacket hung on the hook, the one he'd shrugged off just hours before. His plate, the one with the small chip on the rim, sat unused on the table. We were living in a museum dedicated to a life that had abruptly ceased to be. The chaos began with the sunrise. Clara's quiet terror had metastasized into a frantic, brittle energy. She hadn't slept. Her prayers had turned from whispers to a continuous, silent plea that hung in the air like smoke. I left her there, a sentinel at the window, and went out again. This time, the search felt different. It was no longer a father looking for a son. It was a man hunting for a ghost. The gas station near the turnpike was my first stop. The clerk, a pimply kid with bored eyes, hadn't seen Michael. I bought a coffee I didn't want, just to have something to hold, to feel the heat against my frozen hands. The cup trembled, sloshing brown liquid onto the counter. At the steel mill, the day shift was arriving. I saw them, the men he worked with, laughed with, men named Joe and Frank and Dave. They saw me coming, and a curtain fell over their faces. The bonhomie of the locker room vanished, replaced by a shuffling, awkward pity. "He clocked out, Mr. Croft," Joe said, his eyes fixed on the ground. "Walked to his truck. He was whistling. I swear to God, he was whistling." The parking space where his blue Ford should have been was a void. I stood on that exact patch of oil-stained asphalt, feeling the emptiness radiate up through the soles of my shoes. It was a negative space, a hole punched in the world. The police officer who took my initial call was a study in condescending calm. His voice was a flat, Midwestern drone. "Sir, he's a 24-year-old man. Sometimes they need a break, a few days to blow off steam." "My son doesn't blow off steam," I said, my voice tight, the words clipped. "He comes home for meatloaf." I filed the missing persons report in a daze. The station was too bright, the fluorescent lights humming a tuneless elegy. The officer behind the desk took the information with the weary air of a man cataloging lost luggage. Height, weight, distinguishing features, a scar on his left knee from a bicycle fall, the way he had of pushing his hair back with his left hand when he was thinking. I was reducing my son to a list of biological and behavioral data, and with each item, a little more of my hope chipped away. When I returned, Clara was still in the chair. She didn't ask. She just looked at me, and the last fragile light in her eyes guttered and went out. She made a sound then, a soft, hollow exhalation like the air leaving a corpse. It was the sound of something essential breaking deep inside her. I held her, but my arms were numb. We were two pillars of salt, crumbling in the rain. The weeks that followed were a montage of futility. The police went through the motions. They questioned, they searched, they dredged sections of the river with dragging hooks that came up snagged with riverweed and broken bottles, but never with him. We papered the state with flyers. His face, smiling, confident, stared out from telephone poles and grocery store bulletin boards. That smile became a mockery. People were kind at first. They took the flyers, they promised to look. But their eyes held the truth. They saw us as a tragedy, and tragedies are exhausting to be around. The local news did a segment. They filmed us on our porch, a tableau of grief. Clara held one of Michael's flannel shirts to her face, breathing in a scent that was surely fadding. The reporter called it a baffling disappearance. For 2 days, we were the town's leading mystery. Then a factory fire on the other side of the county took our spot. We were yesterday's news. The seasons turned. Autumn painted the trees in fiery hues, then stripped them bare. Winter laid a thick, silent blanket of snow over the fields, obscuring everything. Inside our house, the cold was of a different kind. Clara stopped cooking proper meals. She would move through the kitchen, a ghost performing the rituals of a life she no longer inhabited. She began sleeping in his room, curled on his narrow bed, her face pressed to a pillowcase that she swore still held his scent. I tried to maintain the facade of normalcy. I fixed fences, paid bills, nodded to neighbors. But I was a golem, animated only by routine. The world had become a hostile place, full of sharp edges and false signs. Every ringing phone was a potential heart attack. Every knock on the door sent a jolt of adrenaline through my system so violent it left me dizzy. The hope was a physical pain, a cramp in the soul that never eased. By the first Christmas, a grim acceptance had begun to set in. The police had stopped calling. The case was now inactive, a bureaucratic term for a parental death sentence. The lead detective, a decent man named Miller, came to the house personally to tell us. He stood on our porch, hat in hand, his face etched with a professional regret. "We've exhausted every lead, Arthur," he said, using my first name for the first time. "There's simply nowhere else to look." Clara received this news with a quiet nod. She had retreated to a place inside herself where I could no longer reach her. She no longer set a place for him at the table, but his chair remained, a sacred, empty throne. The years began to stack up, one upon the other, like layers of sediment burying a lost city. 5 years, 10. The flyers on the telephone poles faded, the rain and sun bleaching Michael's smile into a ghostly smudge. The gravel of our driveway, which had once held the clear imprint of his tires, was now just gravel. Clara's health declined not with a crash, but with a slow, relentless subsidence. The doctor called it chronic depression. I called it a broken heart. She stopped opening the curtains. The vibrant woman who had waved from the porch became a pale, silent figure who flinched at the sunlight. She died in her sleep in the 15th year, still in Michael's old room. On her bedside table was his 5th-grade school picture, the one with the missing front tooth. She was buried with that photograph and the small silver cross necklace he'd saved his allowance to buy her. I didn't go back to the house after the funeral. I couldn't bear the silence. It was no longer the silence of waiting, it was the silence of a tomb. I packed a single duffel bag, walked out the door, and left it unlocked. There was nothing left inside to steal. I became a ghost myself, drifting across the vast, indifferent face of America. I took whatever work I could find that required strong hands and no questions. I painted barns in Kansas, fixed irrigation lines in Nebraska, cut timber in Oregon. I slept in roadside motels where the sheets were thin and the walls were thinner. The sounds of other people's transitory lives a constant reminder of my own rootlessness. I carried a small, leather-bound notebook. It was my atlas of disappointment. Inside were the names of towns, the dates, the descriptions of men who were not my son, a dockworker in Louisiana with his walk, a ranch hand in Montana with his laugh, a homeless man in Phoenix with his eyes. I followed everyone, driving thousands of miles on buckling highways, fueled by a hope that had long since curdled into obsession. Each time, the confrontation was the same, a moment of breathless, heart-stopping recognition, followed by the crushing plunge into reality as the stranger's unfamiliar face stared back at me, annoyed or pitying. I was no longer searching for him. I was chasing the shadow of my own failure, the failure to protect him, the failure to find him, the failure to keep his mother from crumbling into dust. Decades passed. The sharp, specific ache of missing Michael dulled into a constant, low-grade hum of absence, a background radiation in my soul. I eventually settled in a dusty trailer outside Tucson, a place where the sun was relentless and the landscape was as barren as I felt inside. The rituals of survival were simple there. Coffee, the news on a small TV for the noise, a slow walk to an empty mailbox. I had learned to live without expectation. The hope was a vestigial organ, a phantom limb. I thought my story had reached its end, a long, slow fade to gray. I was an old man waiting to die, the mystery of my son, my only companion. I was wrong. The story wasn't over. It was waiting, coiled in the electronic glow of a television screen, to rip the scar tissue from a wound that had never truly healed. The silence was about to be broken, not with a whisper, but with a roar. And the truth it brought would be more shattering than a lifetime of not knowing. The world inside my Tucson trailer had shrunk to the size of a postage stamp. My days were a metronome of quiet desperation. The hiss of the percolator at 6 a.m., the dust motes dancing in the sunbeam that sliced through the blinds, the low drone of the daytime news shows that I never really watched, only heard. They were a voice, a presence, a barrier against the silence that had followed me from Ohio. It was a silence that had a texture now, gritty and dry like the desert sand that constantly found its way under my door. 35 years. The number was no longer a measure of time, but a geological layer laid down over my life. The young, desperate father who had driven 1,000,000 hopeless miles was gone, his energy spent. The middle-aged man burning with a quiet, furious obsession had faded. All that was left was Arthur Croft, an old man in a worn-out armchair, his body a map of aches and his mind a curated museum of loss. The morning it happened was no different. The coffee was bitter, the air conditioner rattled, the TV screen flickered with the bland, cheerful faces of the morning show hosts. I was half dozing, lulled by the rhythm of their inane chatter, when a single word cut through the fog: Nevada. My eyes, against their will, drifted toward the screen. A news anchor, her face a mask of sober gravitas, was introducing a segment. A graphic flashed: Federal Agent Unmasked, DCAD's Long Double Life. I almost looked away. It was the kind of story that had nothing to do with me. Then they showed the photograph. It was a mugshot, but also a press photo. A man in his late 50s, his hair steel gray and cut ruthlessly short, being led from a courthouse. His shoulders were straight, his jaw set, his eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the clamoring reporters. The image was grainy, taken from a distance, but it was like a physical blow to my chest. The air vanished from the room. Time did not slow down, it fractured. The face on the screen was older, hardened, the skin drawn tighter over the bones, the lines around the eyes carved deep by a sun I had never seen. But the architecture was his. The stubborn set of the jaw I'd seen 1,000 times when he was determined to finish a task. The specific, slightly asymmetrical line of his brow. It was Michael, not the ghost I'd been chasing, but the man he had become. The coffee cup, a heavy ceramic mug, slipped from my numb fingers. It hit the floor and exploded, sending shards and dark liquid skittering across the linoleum. The sound was distant, inconsequential. The only sound that existed was the blood roaring in my ears. The reporter's voice was a thin, reedy thing, but I caught every damning syllable. Arrested on charges of identity fraud, passport violation, and perjury, lived for over 3 decades under the name Robert Hale, a trusted contractor for various government agencies. Neighbors described him as a quiet, disciplined man who kept to himself. Robert Hale, the name was a foreign object lodged in my brain. It meant nothing, it was a lie, but the face was my son. The screen split, on one side the recent mugshot, on the other a photograph from a file. It was his government ID badge, Robert Hale. He was wearing a suit, his expression neutral, professional, but it was him, alive, breathing, living, while I had been fossilizing in grief. The reporter continued, her voice clinical, dissecting his life. Marriage records show he was married twice under the assumed identity, divorced once, no children listed. When questioned about his past, he told acquaintances his family had died years ago in a fire. The words "died years ago in a fire" did not feel like words. They felt like a surgical instrument, expertly wielded, severing the last thread connecting me to the world. He hadn't just left, he had killed us. He had buried us in a narrative of his own making, a convenient, tragic backstory for his new, clean life. Clara's slow, painful withering, my decades of nomadic despair, all of it reduced to a fictional fire. I stood up, my knees cracking, my body moving on an instinct I didn't recognize. I stumbled to the small, grimy bathroom and vomited into the sink. It was a dry, wrenching heave, my body trying to expel a poison that was already in my soul. I gripped the cool porcelain, staring at my reflection in the spotted mirror. The face that stared back, weathered, hollow-eyed, ancient, was a stranger's, but the face on the TV, that was the ghost I knew. For 3 days I was a phantom in my own home. I didn't clean the broken mug. I didn't eat. I sat in the dark, the TV off, the silence now a different, more malevolent creature. It was no longer the silence of absence, but the silence of betrayal. The questions didn't just swirl, they screamed. Why? What had we done? What trap had he been fleeing that was so terrible, so inescapable, that this was the only way out? The boy I remembered was kind. He was steady. He loved his mother. The man on the news was a fortress, his eyes holding no kindness, only a calculated distance. Somewhere in the space between that kitchen in Ohio and that courthouse in Nevada, my son had been erased and replaced by Robert Hale. On the fourth day, a cold, clear fury began to burn through the shock. It was a clean emotion, sharper than grief. He was alive. He was reachable. The decades of wondering were over. Now there was only the need for an answer. My hands were steady as I picked up the phone. The tremor that had been my constant companion for years was gone, burned away by a newfound purpose. I called the main number for the Clark County Sheriff's Office in Nevada. My voice, when I spoke, was rough but firm. "I'm calling about Robert Hale," I said. "The man in the news. I need to speak with him." The officer who transferred me sounded bored. I was put on hold, listening to tinny music that felt like a mockery. Finally, a different voice, older, more cautious, came on the line. "This is Sergeant Evans. To whom am I speaking?" "My name is Arthur Croft," I said, each word a deliberate stone placed on a path. "I am his father." The silence on the other end was profound. I could almost hear the recalibration, the shuffling of paperwork, the unspoken "oh shit." "Sir," Evans began, his tone shifting to one of careful, practiced neutrality. "I understand this must be a shock, but Mr. Hale has been very clear. He does not wish to speak with anyone from his previous life." The phrase "previous life" was another scalpel cut. We were a discarded skin. "I don't care what he wishes," I said, the ice in my voice surprising even me. "I am his father. His mother is dead. She died waiting for him. I need 5 minutes. I don't want to argue. I don't want to blame him. I just need to see his face." "Sir, I'm sorry, but I can't." "Put him on the phone," I interrupted, my voice low and deadly. "Or put me through to whoever can make that happen, or I will get in my truck, and I will drive to Nevada, and I will stand outside your jail and say it to his face. And I promise you, I will make a scene the national news will pick up." There was another, longer silence. I heard a muffled conversation, a hand over the receiver. When Evans spoke again, he sounded weary, defeated by my resolve. "Hold the line, Mr. Croft." I held until my knuckles were white around the receiver. I held until I could hear the blood pounding in my temples. I was no longer an old man in a trailer. I was a force. I was the accumulated weight of 35 years of silence, and I was finally speaking. The line clicked. There was a breath, not Evans's. Then a voice I had not heard in 3.5 decades, deepened by age, stripped of all its youthful warmth, flat and devoid of inflection. "Who is this?" It was him, it was Michael, and it was a stranger. "Michael," I said, and the name felt like a relic in my mouth, a word from a dead language. "There's been a mistake," the voice said, automatic, rehearsed. "My family is dead." The sheer brutal finality of it stole my breath. "Look at the news, son," I managed to choke out, my composure cracking. "Your face is all over it. Your real face, I saw it. Your mother, she never stopped. She kept your room. She made your birthday cake every year until she couldn't stand up anymore. She died calling your name. And you told people we burned." The silence from his end was different now. It was not the silence of refusal, but of a man cornered. I could hear him breathing, a slow, measured sound. When he spoke again, the robotic tone was gone, replaced by something colder, harder, a real emotion, not regret, but a fierce, defensive anger. "You don't understand. You could never understand. That life was a cage. That town was a coffin. I couldn't breathe. I saw a way out and I took it." "A way out," the words were a whisper. "We were a cage." "It wasn't about you," he said, and the lie was so transparent it was an insult. "It was about me, becoming someone who mattered, not just a mill worker's son from nowhere, Ohio." "And do you matter now, Robert?" I asked, the name a weapon. "Sitting in a jail cell, your lies unraveled for the whole world to see, Was it worth it? Was it worth your mother's life? He didn't answer for a long time. I could feel him pulling away, retreating behind the walls of his new identity. She's better off, he said finally, the words so monstrous they barely registered. You both are, you should have moved on. The line went dead. The dial tone was a high-pitched scream in my ear. I stood there, the receiver still pressed to my head, long after the tone had stopped. He had not just rejected me, he had annihilated me. He had judged the life we gave him, the love we poured into him, and found it worthless, a cage to be escaped. In the weeks that followed, I learned the full, sordid outline of his second life. Robert Hale had been careful, disciplined. He had built his legend meticulously, using a stolen social security number from a long-dead infant. He had leveraged his natural intelligence and a forged resume into a series of low-level government security contracts. He had wives who never knew the man they married. He had a house in a neat suburban neighborhood. He had a life. A complete, full, fraudulent life. I wrote to him dozens of letters, not angry, not pleading, just factual. I wrote about the color of the sky on the day he left, the sound of his mother's laughter, the way the porch light stayed on for 15 years. I wrote about her funeral, the empty seat, the raw, open wound of his absence. I wrote about the miles I'd driven, the faces I'd searched, the hollow man I had become. I sent them to the federal holding facility. I have no idea if he read them. He never replied. The legal process moved on. The story faded from the news. He was released on bail, his case mired in procedural delays. The last I heard, he had vanished again, not into the ether, but into the labyrinth of the federal justice system. Robert Hale was being dismantled, but Michael Croft was already long gone. I still live in the trailer. The desert sun is relentless. I no longer watch the news. The silence has returned, but it is a different silence now. It is not the silence of waiting, but the silence of a verdict. The mystery is solved. The ghost has a name and a face and a voice that told me we were better off dead to him. People say closure is a gift. They are wrong. Closure is a blade. It severs the frayed, hopeful threads and leaves you with a clean, sharp, unbearable edge. I know where my son is. I know he is alive. And in knowing I have finally truly lost him. The boy who drove away in a blue Ford truck is gone. All that remains is the echo of a stranger's voice on a bad phone line, telling me that the greatest love of my life was nothing but a cage, and that his freedom was worth our destruction. Some truths don't set you free. They build a prison around your heart, and they throw away the key.